What up, everybody? Welcome, Facebook Live. We are here weekdays with Dhati. Again, we have been talking about the coronavirus. We've been talking about the Ahmaud Arbery. We've been talking about stress. We've been talking about emotions. We're helping you study your Bible. We're helping you to proclaim it. We're helping you do that. And really, we're just connecting with one another. And that's really what this time is about. Each and every day, we are here 11 a.m. to get a chance to talk to you, Blueprint, talk to you, church planner, pastor, leader, all throughout North America, all throughout the world. Now that we got people from Pakistan joining us on a consistent basis. So we are here for you every day to talk about issues, things that divide, things that bring us together. We're just here. We want to address, we want to talk, we want to have real talk, real conversations, so that we can be about what God is calling us to do. And so I am excited. I'm excited about the privilege and the opportunity to do this, to meet with you and to talk with you. So let's say what's up to those that are here, and we will kick off. Hopefully today we got DA Horton coming in. There were some technical difficulties, specifically around the link. Like, if you guys don't know, give you a little background. I get on this, never mind. I'm not going to give you any background because he is here. He is here. We are here with my man, Mr. D.A. Horton, always representing the city. Like, hey, let me ask you this question. This is my first question for you. As we're prepared, we're live with the people on Facebook, but like every time you're either wearing a KC hat or an LA hat, so I know you from KC. I mean, I know that, but just kind of like what makes, like what, how do you decide?
Yeah, man. So basically, born early on in life, man, I was a Cardinals fan, but then the Crips moved into our neighborhood, so couldn't wear red anymore. So I was a Kansas City Royals fan for the longest time. And then I always admired the Dodgers, but when we moved out here to Los Angeles, our son Deuce had speech delay, and so he couldn't even say his name, couldn't put words together. So every night before he went to sleep, first few nights we lived here, man, I put on the Dodgers game, and one night I didn't put on the Dodgers game, and he just yelled out Dodger baseball, and I was like, dang, what'd you say? And he said Dodger baseball, and he couldn't even say his name, so I put it back on Ben Scully calling the Dodger game, and he went to sleep in my arms. So I was like, all right, homie, we Dodger fans. So I've been 110% all in ever since then, man.
All right. So do you still represent KC at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's cool, man. But like me, it's a father-son thing, man. And now I've won, my daughter's over. So Alicia, she always holds it down for Kansas City. But I've been called a traitor and, all kinds of things. But hey, as long as me and my son got that bond, man, we all good.
No, that's really good, man. We've been talking, just to give you a little background, every day I get on at 11 a.m. from 11 to 11:30. Here is something that I did specifically because as a church, just like creating a platform and an avenue for us to talk to Blueprint members as a whole about, man, the COVID-19, what's been going on. And in the midst of all of that, obviously we've had, again, the exposure of the things that divide us. Obviously, we all been a part of Corona, being in, something that has created greater division, right? We have seen like the political rhetoric, around Republican, Democrat, blue, red, like that influences how states are opening, reopening, like all of those things. But we're also, in the midst of this, it was actually happened before the Corona, but the Ahmaud Arbery shooting now, but the implications and the ramifications became more popularized in the midst of the COVID-19 kind of shut in and all that. And that has even brought in more exposure. And so we as a church has been just really said, like, what does it look like for us to address it? And so starting last week, I just said every day, we're going to keep talking about it until we talk this thing, out. And, and we just said, what does it look like for us to begin, for us to begin to talk about this in a real way. Hold on real quick. Yeah, just want to make sure the do not disturb is not on here. Yeah, just in a real way for us to really talk about the things that divide. And man, whenever we talk about divide and divisions and reconciliation or conciliation, those things, man, you are always one of the first people that I want to talk about. And this also, the people requested you. Some of you guys may not know is that DA is a former Blueprint member.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
A former Blueprint member of the church, him and Alicia and his lovely daughters. And now he wasn't born when you guys were members.
Yeah.
Was he?
Yeah, I mean early on.
Yeah,
he was so little, man.
So little. Okay, yeah, so little. Yeah. But so there's all of that. So I wanted to bring you on and just talk and really get a chance for you to talk about kind of all the different works that you've done in this area and just kind of hear your heart around this area. But then also to be able to just answer questions that people may have on here and for us to kind of talk about this. Now, DA, let me just kind of start with this, and again, you guys put your comments in the memo, in the chat screen. We want to get through as many questions that you may have. For us is to have real conversation, real talk. We're just trying to create an environment that we can talk. But you guys, last week, I kind of gave a plan for us, and I'm going to allow us to start with, that plan, but even talk about like the various differences, like even me and DA have when it comes to some of the language that we have. We have the same heart, but some of the language that we have in terms of how we go about communicating that. Last week, DA, I talked about the idea of there's a few things that we need to do whenever there's unsettling times, that anything that can divide, there's so much that can divide us. But I said, like, here's some ways that we need to address it. Number one, I said we need to grieve. I mean, that's the first thing, is that we need to grieve. We don't need to go get the facts. We need to grieve. That, we need to grieve personally, and then we need to grieve corporately, right? That's the first thing that we need to do whenever there's tragedy or trauma or those types of things happening. Like the Bible says, rejoice with those who rejoice, grieve with those who grieve, and we need to grieve. So that's the first thing. Tell the truth about what's going on inside. But then I said the second one, and this is the point that I said, that we need to make sure, determine that we are going to be advocates. And when I talk about advocates, I talk about that we need to embrace the ministry of reconciliation. And I know that you don't like the word reconciliation in the midst of these racial conversations. You use the word conciliation, and we'll talk about that. But just like I talk about embracing that we're reconcilers, and our book I talk about the idea of advocates, and that is that we got to run to the tension, we've got to run with the heart of reconciliation and do that. And then the third thing I said, we have to create a plan, of action. It's not just about having talks and creating a hashtag, but we have to create a plan of action. And then at the end, we need to execute the plan. So those are kind of the four things that I kind of hope to frame that. And I would love for us to start off with just even talking about the nuances of the term of reconciliation and conciliation, in there.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think when it comes to the language, I think I've seen a lot of people sidestep the action steps. I think a lot of people, as I've traveled, lived in the South and the Midwest and now out West, it seems like a lot of people don't mind talking about stuff, but then when it comes to the practical application, then people are like, oh man, we don't know how to do this. And, man, when it comes to even terms thrown at each other called racism, racist, things like that, I see people get stuck on terminology, and basically that's it. It just stalemates the conversation, and people have been having these conversations long before we were born, and they'll continue to have them long until after we're gone. And so I just figured, man, when we come to the actual language and where our efforts should be, that's where I just said, man, one day I was talking to someone and I was like, man, how can we have reconciliation when we never had conciliation in mass amongst the nations on American soil? Yeah. And then I was like, well, dang, but then if we think about the work of Christ, that's exactly what he's already done positionally, that when we look at the end of Revelation 7 and we recognize that in the latter parts of Revelation, when we see the multitude that no one can number, and it's every nation, tribe, and tongue, we see that our ethnicity doesn't dissolve. And so I was like, wow, man. So I wonder what's the contention then with race and ethnicity. So even like when I fill out a survey in America, being Latino, Mexican descent, it's not considered technically a race. So then I started studying the history of race and the language and the rhetoric. And then I began to see, oh man, this stuff was created by individuals. So I was like, man, so what has God given us versus what is the culture told us that we are? And so as I began to kind of study that down and look through, I was like, okay, man, so I recognize we've never had conciliation. in order to have conciliation, that means animosity, distrust, and hatred towards each other is dissolved. And then I'm like, well, then there's also a conversation that's broader now, where it's not just the black-white binary anymore. In the 60s, we recognized that. In the 50s, that's where the majority of the population was. But now we are so ethnically diverse in America. Darren Gray puts it like this. He says, we don't watch black and white TV anymore. Everything is higher definition, multicolored, plasma. It's alive. In the same way, when it comes to dialogue about the ethnic tensions that we have in America, it needs to be a mosaic of a conversation versus just black-white binary. And so that's just not where we are. And so I recognize, like, okay, man, how do we recognize moving things forward? And so that's when I began to say, like, man, if we are individuals who are proclaiming the gospel of reconciliation, okay, that's absolutely right. As Christians, we have been reconciled to God. But the reason that we've been reconciled to God is because before the fall in the garden, there was a point of conciliation, not just between man and woman, but between God and the entire human race. If Adam and Eve are the federal representation for the entire humanity, if they're our first father and mother, then we have to recognize, okay, reconciliation is possible for anybody from any ethnic background, any gender, any social class, because if all of our family trees root back to Adam and Eve, there was conciliation in the garden. So now everyone potentially can be reconciled to God through Christ alone. So then I began to say, okay, then I think we need to fight for a point of conciliation in America, because we have not seen that historically in the United States of America en masse. So that's where the language comes, is to kind of like, is, as you said, we have the same heart, and though I'm trying to come at it from a different perspective, because I'm sick and tired of the stalemate. People will pick up your book and they'll be like, oh, that was a good book by Dhati. All right, let me go read another book. Okay, at some time you got to stop reading the books and start doing it. And so that's where it's like getting very frustrated.
Man. And that's why I love you, DA, man. I mean, I've worked with DA. DA was a part of helping to start, some of you guys going to pull back in the treasure chest, rebuild, to all of those things that some of you guys don't even know. But DA has been my man, and he has been something I've respected. And it's because of his thoughtfulness and the details, the nuance, being action-driven. Like, he is a scholar of all scholars, but at the same time, he's also a practitioner. He's someone who's not just talking high up high in the sky, but he's someone who's actually trying to do all of these things. And so, and I love the detail. I have to admit, DL, I'm more of a kind of a big picture thinking. I was just like, okay, reconciliation is good. Let's go. Let's move, But I love the nuances that you brought out. And I would agree with everything that you're saying and what you're doing. Again, if you guys have questions or comments, please put it on the screen. Let me just kind of scroll through the CEOs on. There's all the way from my wife, Sam Dula's on here, Jackie Taylor's on here. They all say, what's up to you, DA?
What's up?
We have elders, we have Titus 2 women. Even Alexis Coops is on here. He said, yo, Damon, what's up, bro? Yeah, Lucius is on here saying, what's up? And he said he loved the book Intentional. He said he loved it, appreciated it. The question, Lucius, did you do anything about it? DA said he's tired of having people read it. Did you do anything about it, Pastor Lucius? That's the question. That's the real question.
Me and Lucius had a good conversation probably about, like, man, it's got to be like 6-7 years ago, man, when I was still a Blueprint. We were talking about just music in the church and how, people will come and they'll be committed to a church just for the music. They don't care about the preaching. They don't care about, so even when we talk about some of the preferences of people, me and Lucius, we were talking before, it was after service one day at Blueprint, and I was like, it might be dope, man, if y'all took, like, if you're going to sing 5 songs, like, make sure, like, if you could do 5 different genres, like every week, like if you could have one CCM joint, if you could have one throwback gospel, one contemporary gospel, like if you could have, one chorus like they used to sing in the 80s, and if you have a hymn, I'm like, and you can then like take those and allow the band to just be creative. And like, if y'all want to do Amazing Grace, like in a reggaeton, then do it. But just even the diversity in the music and the delivery to help people recognize that, man, if we're going to be multi-ethnic, multicultural, we have to be multi-genre as well as we express within the culture of Blueprint worship to God. It was a very fruitful conversation me and Lucius had, but that was one thing that I was like, man, is being a member of Blueprint in the heart of Atlanta and recognizing, like, man, we were in that tension, man, of everything that you and I are talking about, Dhati. It's like, now how do we, from a worship standpoint, address this. And I was like, man, diversity in the selection, diversity in the way that it's played and the arrangement of the music as well, to show people, man, no matter where they are on the spectrum, like, oh man, we can still worship God and be together, even with the different genres represented of people's musical preferences.
Man, I think that's spot on. And what I love about that, that's a practical way about how to be intentional, right? About cultivating and creating that conciliation or reconciliation that oftentimes that we're talking about in a practical and pragmatic way. So again, what are some questions? What are some thoughts that you guys have? Did you obviously hear already? I don't even have to give any further introduction about the weight and the nuance. And again, the nuance of, and the accuracy and the nuance that DA brings when he's answering questions. And that's what I love is that he considers his words as he's speaking, and so you got people on here. Holly said that she heard you speak in 2014. She's a staff member at Union University.
Oh, wow.
Union University. So that is good. Yeah. So we're talking about the idea of just, so people are commenting on conciliation, and all of the different things, and Ange Hart, she's here. She said, she says, I'm here for amazing grace and reggae in a reggaeton. So Pastor Lucius, so now we're getting requests. We're getting requests on here now about like what's going on. So you guys, what are your thoughts? What are your comments? Again, put them in the chat in terms of what we have. DA, how have you kind of pastored your church, in your group around the specific situation around the Ahmaud Arbery shooting?
It's a blessing, man, to have other men in leadership with me that are engaged in the dialogue with our members through our community group structure. Like at Blueprint, we have missional communities here. At Reach, we have community groups. And just processing, man, the Ahmaud Arbery situation is one of many. When we first moved to Los Angeles, that was the year that everything was going viral. It was 2016. There were so many hashtags. The T-shirts were just now getting put out. Philando Castile, I think, was murdered shortly after we got here. And it was an election year. So we were like right in the thick of it then, very similar to today.
And it just seems like, these, and I say exposed, and I use that word because like you said, there's so many things that are happening in the non-election years, but it just seems like in the election years, that is when these things are brought out even more. Like you said, like it was Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter. That was all 2016 going into the first election, President Trump's first election. And now it seems like these things again are bubbling up to the top on a national scale. It's not that they're just happening, but they're bubbling up where like you can't avoid them in a sense, So it just seems like it happens more so in election year.
Yeah, and I think also, and that's preventative of Christians. Now, I'm only talking to Christians. It's preventative of Christians even having great gains, dialoguing about, the issues that surface when these videos arise. I mean, people will go to their, Fox News, their MSNBC, their CNN, and they will quote statistics, send links, drop links on Facebook posts without any comments or anything. And it's just like, man, that's just adding fuel to the fire. And, I always think about something that I talk about in Intentional, but I reference a man by the name of Francis Schaeffer, who was a phenomenal Christian philosopher. Back in 1982, he wrote a book called The Great Evangelical Disaster. And he mentioned 3 weaknesses inside of evangelicalism. The first is that racism, slavery, and segregation have never been properly repented for or dealt with. And it will continuously be an issue in the church until the church deals with it. That's the first point. The second point is that there's a lot of wealth in American Christians that have been made without the means of justice. So injustice has been leveraged to build the wealth of people, specifically even in the church. And the wealth is not being used with compassion. Rather, it's being used to build up personal peace and affluence. So people don't want to live on Jesus's mission. They just want to make sure that they pad their finances, that their personal peace. Don't bother me with mission trips. Don't bother me with witnessing and sharing the gospel. Like, just I'll give to the church. Let me do my Christianity the way I want. And then number 3 is that any nation that wraps the cross of Jesus in the flag of its nation is synchronized and created a false Christianity. And I think what is going on is that people are leaning towards that, wrapping the cross of Christ in the American flag. I mean, just even like after World War, this is what I'm saying, there's historic reasons to this. And if we don't read history, we won't understand it. We're just trying to jump in 2020 without giving deep consideration for what's going on. But after World War II, there was this big pride in America. America was now the watchdog for the world, ethically, morally, democratically. And so phrases like "in God we trust" became our motto, adding one nation under God to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. Like all that stuff started happening then. So the phrase "for God and country," like when you begin to think about that, and one thing that I find interesting is that even prior to that, back in the 1800s and the 1700s, when Manifest Destiny, when Americans were moving westward, they were using a lot of the biblical framings from the Exodus, from Joshua, from Judges as language, very similar to what the Hebrew Israelites were using for the narrative of the Exodus, the Promised Land and things of that nature, being enslaved in Egypt. So you had the Bible being used by two different groupings of individuals, people with wealth, power, and privilege that were saying, God has given us this country from sea to shining sea, from ocean to ocean. This is ours. This is our conquest. And then you have the other.
Amen. I just want to know. Yes, I think we are still on. Okay. He's back. All right. So they said broadcast interrupted, but we're back. We'll just keep this kind of going on here. No, I think that was really good. Sorry for that interruption. Hey, technology, we're dependent on it. We're grateful for it. But again, it is a tool that we have. So we're still on it. So no, I think that's really good. Understanding our history, I think, is a critical piece for us to know. And man, that history that you just gave, can you quote that source again? What was the source that you have?
Yeah, Francis Schaeffer, The Great Evangelical Disaster.
Francis Schaeffer, The Great Evangelical Disaster. If someone can put a link on there to put it in. And also someone put the link on to DA's book, Intentional. Is that what you would say is a starting place in terms of your resources, that for someone who is wanting to learn about this, what would you say is a starting place for you if they want to learn your thoughts and research on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously Intentional, and then also look at the bibliography, because I quote a lot of sources in that, so that people who read Intentional can basically be launched out to read and to study and discover other people's perspectives, some of the historical truths, also some of the sociological assessments of people and things of that nature. So yeah.
Good. All right, so let's get into some of the questions you guys have been putting in the chat. Again, we're going to try to speed round through some of these questions in the remaining time that we have. All right, so this is from James Hart. He says, DA, you mentioned how you learned race is a construct made up by individuals. In the same way, hasn't American evangelicalism been shaped by the same individuals who created race? If that's true, how does the church work through separating the racialized version of our faith versus the ancient multi-ethnic Christianity we see in the early churches, specifically in Acts?
Absolutely. Great question. Yeah, I think, again, that's where studying church history is something that I think every believer should be versed in. When we recognize the roots of our family trees and we see how the church fathers and the church mothers were engaging and applying the text, looking at what body life looked like, we can.
All right. So again, can you answer that question about the evangelicalism, or no, the question specifically around how did you navigate that?
Yeah, I think speaking to injustices from a historical perspective, provided me the space to be considered an ally amongst African Americans. But at the same time, also, there became nuances and challenges that I recognized, like even with law enforcement, having individuals in our church that were part of that when we were a blueprint, being sensitive in the things that I communicated publicly. So at the end of the day, what I recognized, and I didn't start get comfortable with my own skin until after I moved to LA, that I began to, Amisho made a comment to me. I had moved to LA and came back to Atlanta for a couple of days. And I remember Amisho was like, man, that boy DA moved to LA and found out he was Mexican. Because everything about my life rhythm did not scream Mexican, only outside of my skin color. I ain't got a broken accent with Spanish. And so I grew up in a predominantly African-American community. So there was a lot of rhythms in sync that I had with the African-American community. But at the same time, what I began to recognize is that I was never going to be liberal enough or progressive enough for some people. And then I was too conservative for some people. Then I was never conservative enough for others. And then I began to recognize that I have to be comfortable in my own skin. I have to be dedicated and faithful to scripture. I have to be wise when I speak on things, regardless of my ethnicity, because I'm going to be attacked by anybody and everybody. And that's what has been the hardest thing about being Latino in the conversation, is that if I talk about the black-white binary, then people will be like, well, black people have suffered more than any other people group. And I'm like, okay, yeah, like that's a truth. And then my homie Jason and his wife Alma, they have a podcast, The Red Couch. Like, they call it the oppression Olympics. And I would say, like, man, every minority people group in America is going to have nuances of historical facts saying we've been oppressed, we've suffered. But the problem is, then we take the focus off of the gains that we can make. And now we start saying, well, no, our people had it worse. No, our people had it worse. We still got it better, right? So, like, all that stuff, we had to, like, learn to nuance. So then I began to say, well, then having a holistic approach, like not just talking about it, just one of about food deserts? What about equity in education? What about financial aspects? What about economic aspects? Now starting to look more holistically and inclusive of the gospel proclamation in that is a way that I found forward. Sometimes people consider me an ally. Some people are different, and I don't get much feedback from people. But other times it's like the most dialogue is in dissent. And it's either because they're like, I disagree with you, you're spreading conspiracy theories and things of that nature. But that's where I'm like, man, look, I'm just trying to get us to make gains in the church.
Yeah. So how do you personally, like, in emotionally, I know you've been outspoken about just kind of your emotional health and all that. Like, how do you personally emotionally navigate through that? Because what I've learned is that this is a very emotionally charged subject. Anything that divides it could be very traumatizing. It can trigger different things. So the question becomes, is like, emotionally, how do you not just simply become codependent, right? Like just starting to look into everybody's faces and say, okay, what do I need to say to them so that you can be good and you can be okay? But maintain that identity. As you kind of talked about that journey and that quest that you've had, how have you done that?
Yeah, so obviously time with the Lord and evaluating my heart first and foremost. I had to even answer the questions of, why do I feel so exhausted? What's making me exhausted? And there was a couple of things. One, I felt like I was alone a lot of the times. I felt like people wouldn't respect what I said because I am Latino, because I'm not black. Some people would be like, yeah, see, man, here's a dude that ain't black and he's saying exactly what we've been telling y'all. But then that would lead to a whole nother set of problems, because people were like, oh, they accept what you say because you have lighter skin than we do. And they'll never accept, what Dhati says, because Dhati's always going to be the angry black man. So whatever DA says, it's more acceptable to people who are lighter because he ain't an angry black man. He's just passionate. So I would get that. I would also get people that would be like, this dude ain't saying nothing new. African-Americans been saying this for centuries. So who is this dude? Like, man, whatever. We need to go to the trusted voices we have in our own community. So there would be that, so that's where I had to say, am I doing this for the praise of people? Am I doing this to even sell books? Am I doing this to be a conference speaker? Am I doing this as a gimmick to give my life purpose? And then I had to answer those real questions and begin to say, no, I'm trying to be a prophetic voice in the midst of chaos, in the midst of rhetoric, in the midst of hatred, even within the church. That's why a lot of my work is focused on the church. Because, man, we have lost our witness so often. And so one of the few times that I've been invited to the public square to talk about it, I had a whole different set of issues that came up with persecution, because to the non-believing community, they got sick of me talking about race, because I'm not inclusive to the LGBTQI struggle woven into the intersectionality aspects of ethnicity and gender and things of that nature. So they'd be like, yeah, we know about race. We've been talking about race forever, but what about the LGBTQ community? What about this? Are you going to change your theological position? So it was like a whole different, and I'm like, man, y'all don't even want to hear what I got to say. Right. Y'all just trying to get a sound bite so then you can pigeonhole me into this. And unfortunately, sometimes it's like that in the church. So that's why I have to go to the Lord. I have to make sure I go to my brothers who are in my inner circle, dialogue with my wife. And I've just learned that there's also, the last thing I'll say on this, there's also a lot of opportunists within the church that will want to use you, that will want to use what you say to market themselves, or they'll want you on their panel, or they'll want you on their lineup, so that whoever followed you may gravitate to their space and gain exposure to what they have to say or what they're trying to do. So, and that's not just people of European ethnicity, man. Like, I've had to learn that I have to keep my inner circle very, very small, man. And I have to make sure, because I've been used too many times. I've shared my notes and research with people, man, and they've just taken it. And I'm just like, oh, man, okay, at the end of the day, it's the Lord's. But then at the same time, I'm like, man, I just got to be more guarded and less naive. And that's what I do believe, man. Some people do use this topic. They don't want to see people change. They don't want to see goodness happen. Because if we start doing what I call ethnic conciliation, it's going to put people out of job. It could put me out of a job, which is okay. And that's why I tell people, this is not the only bullet in the chamber of my ministry weapon. Like this issue of ethnicity and race, injustice, it's not the only thing I preach about. So if it's the only thing I talk about, then yeah, I want the problems to continue on so that I can keep talking. But at the end of the day, I'm like, this is one of 99 other issues that the people of the body of Christ are engaging with. So I don't put all my chips in this one basket. I hit on it hard, and then I'm like, okay, now we got to talk about finances. Now we got to talk about addictions of our past life that we got to watch. Now we got to talk about walking in the spirit, not the flesh. It's not just about this one issue. So I've had to learn.
And so how do you differentiate between, because I mean, I mentioned that last week, one of the things is that has constantly come up in this chat is, man, there's so many churches that are silent. They don't say anything. They don't do anything. It's the silence of the church. And, and I've kind of said, hey, kind of push back a little bit and says, if God has placed a burden on you, it is important for you to be that conduit in that local church or in that context. Because, like, for instance, and I gave the example, like, Blueprint Church is a pro-life church, right? From the cradle all the way to the grave, right? And so pro-life, and we think this is a pro-life issue. Now, when it comes to that spectrum of pro-life, Blueprint Church has never did any formal thing on abortion, right? And there's people that may say, well, Blueprint Church is not talking about abortion, so they don't care or whatever. And they could easily kind of put me in the in the pro-abortion circle because I've never spoken out, or whenever we see babies being murdered in the womb, that because I'm not speaking out about that. So it's the same thing when it comes like to issues of race, like, I believe God diversifies the body and places different burdens on people, that everybody can have all the burdens. Like, I can't wake up with all the different diversity of burdens in the world that are significant, but as a church leader, like, while I can't hold all the burdens, it doesn't make abortion any less, or it doesn't make race any less. But to some degree, people who are burdened for these subject matters, it's like God has placed that burden on you to be able to be that light. And I think to some degree, we got to give congregations and pastors and leaders the opportunity to deny it versus just simply say, because they're not talking about it, it's not important, and then just automatically throw them under the bus. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what Paul is saying in Ephesians 4, is that the leaders of the church are to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. I think that's something that the members, if they're passionate about that, they should approach leadership and say, hey, what would it look like to get the church's endorsement, or how can I go about as a member of Blueprint Church to go stand in front of Planned Parenthood and hand out tracts and pray for people? Or, like my mother, man, I'll give an example. Like, some people would talk about the aspects of abortion. Oh, Damon, you don't talk about abortion as much as you do ... And if you were really for people of African descent, then you would have communicated how many babies have been aborted and ... And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And I'm like, but at the same time, if that's your area of focus and specialization, then amen, run with it. If I'm not saying it doesn't mean, if I'm not saying anything against you, I'm for you. But at the same time, I can't tackle every topic, every moment of every day. Here's something that I've lived by, man, at least for the last 12 years. I think in the church, because what you're saying, I think sometimes is leveraged as an excuse for people to do nothing.
Yep.
So here's why I say that, because it seems like a million Christians would want one person to get up and say a million different things, while the million Christians don't say one thing. And so that's where I'm like, there's strength in our numbers, man. If some people are more focused on physical health and they're believers in Jesus, and they're talking about physical and physiological issues that are plaguing communities of color, like high blood pressure, diabetes, like heart disease, if somebody's passionate about that and mobilizing for community resources and they're an advocate for the gospel of man, do that. Amazing. You can get more ground spread with 30 Christians from one church doing that than one dude doing a 30-minute podcast. And so I'm like, if we get out there and engage in that way, and that's one thing that we have not been able to do it at Reach Fellowship, but that's one thing that I'm hoping that the brothers that continue with the church leadership will do, is have what we call a leadership council, where it's a man and a woman under the acronym FABRIC, where you have families, authorities, business, religion, institutions of learning and rehabilitation, and then culture, where you have a man and woman that are experts in those 6 areas. And that's where their education, their workspace is, and they're speaking to the elders of the church and saying, here are missional opportunities in the spaces that we live in on a day-to-day basis. Here's missional opportunities. And then the elders are hearing that, they're praying through it, and then they're opening opportunities for the membership at large to now mobilize into the streams of the community for gospel proclamation, but then also shalom demonstration to say we're going about this holistically. So that way, if people say, man, I ain't going to hear about Ahmaud Arbery because y'all don't talk about abortion, you know what? Then if that's your personal choice, then that's laziness. That's laziness, man. Right. Like, that's you need to get out and be an advocate for both. We have to stop putting these issues of justice at ends with each other as if it's a silver bullet to say, I ain't got to worry about racism until y'all worry about abortion. Really? Yeah. Is that God glorifying? Is that Christ honoring? Is that exalting of the Imago Dei? Nah, man, it's both and, not either or. And I think that's where we are, in the same place we were in 2016 when it comes to these conversations, the same place they were in 1966. Because people also want to say, well, you ain't doing 5 things. Until you do 5 things, then I'll do one. That's a lie. Because if they did it or not, you still do it.
I love what you're saying. I mean, you said about there one person saying a million things versus the million people going out. That is so critical. So thinking then how we pit issues of justice against one another and how that paralyzes us to not do anything, or we use it as an excuse to not do anything. I think those are golden, in terms of what we do. But we need to be called to action. DA, I appreciate you staying overtime. I really do appreciate you staying overtime in this. We'll try to see if we can bring all these 2 videos together, and bring it, because it was such great content. He mentioned so many great resources, so many great books, and I'm hopefully that we'll have those resources in the chat. Remember, there's a blog that we put out about this, and we'll make sure that we put out the blog about this, because we want to give you guys tools to help you, and hopefully that these tools, I hope you to move into real action. When it comes, again, what we talked about is just like, we got to grieve. We got to, determine that it's going to be about conciliation or reconciliation. And we got to create a plan, and then we got to execute the plan. It doesn't just start with just talking, right? That is not the end point. It's like, how do we create a plan, and how do we execute the plan, and how do we create tools in order to do that? And so, again, man, we're gonna have to bring you back on, DA. I mean, and then we'll work on our internet in Atlanta as we do that, so that we can all figure this out. But man, this has been very helpful. I appreciate it. Tell Alicia, everybody, man, I said what's up. Miss you guys, and and look forward until whenever the travel bans are off and all that stuff. Looking forward to coming back and seeing you guys in Cali.